The ballroom glowed behind a wall of glass, filled with white roses, crystal chandeliers, and nearly 200 people celebrating my younger sister's perfect wedding. From the hotel corridor, I could see Heather laughing beside her new husband, while our parents accepted congratulations as though they had personally built the happiness surrounding them. In a way, they had. They had paid for the ballroom, the imported champagne, the designer dress, the orchestra, the flowers, the photographer, and the 5-tier cake. They had simply used my money to do it. My phone vibrated in my hand. The message came from Jessica Monroe, the attorney I had hired less than 2 weeks earlier. Everything has been filed. The civil complaints are scheduled for delivery tomorrow morning. The district attorney's financial crimes unit has the evidence package. Do not confront them tonight. I read it twice, then locked my phone. Across the ballroom, my mother spotted me and waved impatiently, as though I were late for a family photograph instead of standing at the edge of the most expensive crime scene I had ever seen. 6 years earlier, my grandfather had left me a lake house called Harbor's Rest. My parents had forged my signature, sold the property without my knowledge, and used a large portion of the proceeds to fund Heather's wedding. At least, that was the part I already understood. What I had not yet discovered was that the house sale had only been one piece of a plan that began months before Heather ever chose her dress. I adjusted the silver ribbon on the wedding gift in my arms and entered the ballroom. My grandfather once told me that truth did not need to shout, it only needed to arrive at the right moment. That night, I let my family celebrate, because, by the time the wedding ended, everything holding their perfect lives together was already beginning to collapse. My grandfather named the house Harbor's Rest before I was born. It stood at the end of a narrow road in western Massachusetts, surrounded by white pines, silver birches, and enough silence to make a person hear her own thoughts clearly. The house itself was modest. It had weathered gray shingles, a deep front porch, 2 small bedrooms upstairs, a narrow kitchen with uneven floorboards, and a stone fireplace my grandfather had built with his own hands. The dock stretched into a dark blue lake that remained cold even in summer. To my mother, it was an old house that required too much work. To my father, it was an asset that should have been sold years earlier. To Heather, my younger sister, it was a pretty background for photographs. To me, it was the only place where I had never felt like I had to earn the right to belong. My earliest memories lived there. I remembered waking before sunrise, to the smell of coffee and cedar smoke. I remembered sitting beside Grandpa Jack on the dock, while mist drifted over the water. He would hand me a fishing rod and pretend not to notice, when I became impatient after several minutes. "Stillness is part of the work," he used to say. At 8 years old, I thought he meant fishing. It took me decades to understand that he was teaching me how to survive people who expected me to react before I had time to think. Grandpa never treated me like a child whose opinions were decorative. When I asked why the porch leaned slightly toward the lake, he showed me how the ground shifted after winter. When I wanted to help repaint the shutters, he gave me a brush instead of telling me I would make a mess. When I complained that Heather never helped, he did not defend her. "She has not learned to value what effort protects," he said. That sentence stayed with me. Heather was 6 years younger than I was, and had always been the softer child in our parents' eyes. If she cried, everyone stopped what they were doing. If I cried, my mother asked what practical solution I had tried first. When I earned a scholarship to study architecture, my parents congratulated me over dinner and reminded me not to become arrogant. When Heather was accepted into a less competitive program, they hosted a party. I learned early that resentment would not change them. So I built a life that did not depend on their approval. I studied architecture in Boston and eventually specialized in restoring old buildings without erasing the history that made them worth saving. Grandpa said I had learned to listen to structures. By the time I was in my late 20s, I was helping transform abandoned mills, courthouses, and brick warehouses into spaces people wanted to use again. On weekends, I drove to Harbor's Rest. Grandpa and I repaired porch rails, replaced damaged boards on the dock, cleaned gutters, and argued gently about which windows needed replacing. Heather visited occasionally, usually when someone else had already done the difficult work. She loved sitting on the dock in a white sundress. She loved photographs beneath the birch trees. She did not love scraping paint or clearing storm debris. My parents visited even less. My mother complained about insects and the lack of fashionable restaurants nearby. My father admired the lake but disliked the cost of maintaining the property. For years, he encouraged Grandpa to sell. "The market is good," he would say. "You could invest the money." Grandpa always refused. "Some things are worth more when you keep them." My father considered that sentimental nonsense. One winter afternoon, I arrived at Harbor's Rest and found my father and grandfather arguing in the kitchen. My father had spread several real estate brochures across the table. "You are sitting on money you do not use," he said. "I use the house every day," Grandpa replied. "You are old enough to need a place closer to doctors." "I have a doctor." "You are being stubborn." "No. I am saying no." My father noticed me in the doorway and gathered the papers immediately. "This is a private conversation." Grandpa looked at me. "No, it is not." He folded one of the brochures and handed it back to my father. "The house is not for sale." My father left angry. Afterward, Grandpa asked me to walk with him to the dock. The lake had begun to freeze along the edges. "I updated my estate plan," he said. I felt uncomfortable immediately. "You don't have to talk about that." "Yes, I do." He looked toward the house. "Your parents believe ownership should follow need." "What does that mean?" "It means they believe the person who wants something most has the strongest right to it. That is not how ownership works." "No." He smiled faintly. "That is why I am leaving Harbor's Rest to you." I shook my head. "Grandpa, you understand what it costs to keep. You understand what it means. It is your home." It was. Soon it will need to become someone else's responsibility. I looked away, because I did not want him to see the fear in my face. He placed a hand over mine. "Claire, there may come a day when your family tells you that protecting yourself is selfish. They may say peace matters more than truth, because peace is more comfortable for them." Why would they say that? Because people often call a boundary cruel when it prevents them from taking something. 3 weeks later, he died quietly in his sleep. He had been 84. His will was read in the office of his longtime attorney, Martin Keller. Grandpa divided his savings among my mother, my father, Heather, and me. He left personal items to friends and relatives. But Harbor's Rest, including the land, furniture, dock rights, storage shed, and everything inside the house, went solely to me. My mother's face tightened when Martin read the provision. My father shifted in his chair. Heather glanced at me with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief. "Well," she said, "everyone knew you were his favorite." "I wasn't his favorite." Mother released a short laugh. "Claire, there is no need to pretend." Martin interrupted. "Jack's decision was based on stewardship. He documented Claire's long involvement in maintaining the property and expressed a specific wish that it remain in the family." My father asked whether the house could be sold. Martin looked at me. "That decision belongs entirely to Claire. The estate transferred cleanly. The deed was recorded in my name. I purchased insurance, established automatic tax payments, and created a separate account for repairs and maintenance. For the first year, I visited almost every weekend. Then work became demanding. I was promoted to senior project architect. I began managing larger developments, attending public hearings, and traveling regularly. I still went to Harbor's Rest, but sometimes months passed between visits. My parents offered to help. "We are closer than you are," my mother said. "We can check the mail and make sure the house looks occupied." At first, I declined. Then my father reminded me that empty houses were vulnerable to frozen pipes, storm damage, and theft. The offer seemed practical. I gave them a spare key, but no ownership authority. I asked the local post office to send official correspondence to my Boston address. Property taxes and insurance were paid automatically, so I assumed there was little risk. For several years, the arrangement appeared to work. My father sent occasional photographs after storms. My mother complained about dust. Heather used the porch for engagement pictures before she was actually engaged. There were moments that bothered me. though I did not understand why at the time. Once, my father asked where I kept the original deed. In a safe deposit box, I told him. Which bank? I laughed. Why? Just wondering. Another time, my mother suggested adding one of them as an authorized property manager. What if something happens while you are overseas? She asked. You can call me. What if we cannot reach you? Then call the insurance company. She looked irritated. You always make everything so formal. I thought she was offended because I did not fully trust her. Looking back, she was frustrated because trust alone did not give her the legal authority she wanted. 5 years after Grandpa's death, Heather met Lucas Bennett. Lucas came from a polished family with money, connections, and expectations. His mother chaired charity boards. His father owned several medical office properties. Their social world revolved around private schools, country clubs, and expensive traditions. Heather wanted to impress them. Within weeks of becoming engaged, she began discussing a wedding that seemed designed less to celebrate marriage than to prove she belonged in Lucas's world. She wanted a historic hotel ballroom in Boston. She wanted imported roses, custom invitations, a string quartet during cocktails, an orchestra after dinner, monogrammed linens, a photographer from New York, and a designer gown she had seen in a magazine. My parents encouraged her. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event, my mother said. I did not point out that most people used that phrase immediately before spending money they did not have. At a family dinner, Heather showed us a presentation from her wedding planner. The estimated budget made me put down my fork. That cannot be the final number, I said. Heather's smile faded. Why not? Because it is more than many people earn in several years. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. My father waved his hand. We have a financial plan. What plan? My mother's eyes met mine. You do not need to worry about it. I am not worried. I am curious. Heather closed the laptop. Can we please not turn my wedding into an accounting meeting? I let the conversation end. But as I drove back to Boston that night, Grandpa's warning returned to me. People often called a boundary cruel when it prevented them from taking something. 2 days later, my father called. When was the last time you visited the lake house? He asked. A few months ago. You should probably make time to go soon. At the time, I heard concern. Later, I understood it had been fear. Looking back, they had started planning long before I noticed. Heather's wedding planning consumed the family. Every conversation became about seating charts, dress fittings, floral samples, menu tastings, transportation, favors, and whether gold lettering looked more elegant than silver. I attended when expected and stayed quiet whenever possible. Heather and I had never been close in the way sisters in sentimental movies were close. We did not exchange secrets or call each other every evening. Our relationship had always been shaped by comparison. I was responsible. Heather was charming. I was independent. Heather was sensitive. I was expected to understand. Heather was expected to be understood. During the months leading up to the wedding, work became unusually demanding. My firm was restoring a 19th-century courthouse, and problems emerged in the foundation that required daily coordination between engineers, contractors, preservation officials, and city representatives. I often worked 12-hour days. My father continued checking Harbor's Rest. At least, he said he did. He sent photographs, though I later noticed they were framed tightly enough to avoid showing the driveway or neighboring properties. My mother told me the house was fine. No leaks, no broken windows. Your father cleared the gutters. I thanked them. One Thursday, I decided to drive to Harbor's Rest for the weekend. I packed a bag and called my mother to tell her I would be there by evening. She reacted too quickly. You cannot go this weekend. Why? There is a contractor there. What contractor? Your father noticed damage beneath the porch. He did not tell me. He wanted to handle it. I need to approve any work. It is already scheduled. What company? She paused. I do not remember the name. I will speak to Dad. He is busy. The conversation felt wrong. I called my father. He confirmed that a contractor was inspecting the porch foundation. Do not drive all the way out, he said. There will be tools and debris everywhere. I can still go. There is no point. What company is there? Another pause. Some local crew. You hired a company without telling me its name? He became irritated. We are trying to help you, Claire. I canceled the trip. Months later, a neighbor would tell me that on that exact weekend, a real estate agent had shown Harbor's Rest to Daniel and Sarah Peterson. The so-called contractor had been an inspector. At the time, I believed my parents because disbelief required an explanation I was not ready to consider. Several days later, I received an email that appeared to come from the county tax office. The subject line mentioned an address confirmation. I opened it between meetings. The email asked me to verify the mailing address associated with Harbor's Rest. Because the property identification number was partially obscured and the message contained an unfamiliar link, I assumed it was phishing and deleted it. A week later, an envelope arrived at my Boston apartment from a regional bank. It stated that a request had been made to update contact information associated with one of my older accounts. I barely remembered the account. Years earlier, after my father injured his back, I had opened a joint checking account with my parents so I could help with rehabilitation expenses and household bills. Once he returned to work, the account remained open with a small balance. I had forgotten about it. I logged into my primary banking portal, but did not see the old account listed. I assumed it had been closed or placed in inactive status. I put the letter in a drawer and returned to work. The next warning came from a notary service. A woman left a voicemail asking me to confirm that I had signed documents connected to a property transaction. The message was vague and did not include an address. I called back, but the number led to a generic mailbox. I left my name and received no response. When I mentioned it to my mother, she laughed. Probably a scam. That was my thought. You are too busy. You are becoming paranoid about every little thing. Her words embarrassed me. I had always disliked appearing dramatic, especially around my family. They had spent years telling me that I overanalyzed everything. So I ignored the voicemail. Heather's wedding expenses continued to grow. The guest list began around 120 people. Then Lucas's parents added business associates, distant relatives, and friends from their club. The number climbed to nearly 200. Heather upgraded the ballroom package. She changed photographers because the first company's style was not editorial enough. She added a second dress for the reception. She hired a makeup artist from New York and booked a luxury suite for the entire wedding weekend. At a bridal luncheon, I overheard her telling a friend that the floral installation alone cost more than some cars. She sounded proud. Later, near the restaurant entrance, I asked her directly, "Are you and Lucas taking on debt for this?" Her expression hardened. "Why do you care?" "Because you are my sister. That has never made you supportive." "I am asking a practical question." She crossed her arms. "Mom and Dad are handling most of it." "With what money?" Heather looked away. "They made investments." "What kind?" "I do not know. Ask them." I did. "Then stop asking me." She walked toward the valet stand, then turned back. "Have you been to the lake recently?" The question felt abrupt. "No." "How long?" "A few months." "Why?" "No reason." She looked toward the street. "I just wondered whether you still used it." "I do." "You hardly go." "That does not mean I do not use it." Heather gave a small shrug. "I guess it seems wasteful for one person to hold on to an entire house." My chest tightened. Grandpa left it to me. "I know. Do you think he made the wrong decision?" She sighed. "Why does everything have to become a conflict with you?" "You brought up the house." I was making conversation. "No, you were not." The valet brought her car, ending the discussion. As she drove away, I stood beneath the restaurant awning and considered calling my father. Instead, I convinced myself that Heather was jealous, nothing more. A week later, my mother invited me to dinner. She and my father were unusually cheerful. My father opened an expensive bottle of wine. My mother described the final wedding menu. Heather showed photographs from her dress fitting. Lucas arrived late and seemed distracted. During dinner, I noticed a thick white envelope on the sideboard with the logo of a title and escrow company printed in the corner. My father saw me looking. "Work paperwork," he said. "You do not work in real estate." One of our investments. My mother changed the subject immediately. The ballroom lighting will completely transform the space. I looked at my father. What investment? He smiled without answering. Lucas stared at his plate. When I left, Heather followed me to the front hall. You could try being happy for me. I am happy you are getting married. You do not act like it. I am concerned about the money. There. That is what I mean. You always make everything sound irresponsible. Is it responsible? Her eyes flashed. You had Grandpa giving you property. Some of us have to accept help where we can get it. The sentence stayed with me. You know something about Harbor's Rest, I said. Her face changed for only a moment. Then she laughed. You are imagining things. Heather, I have to finish the seating chart. She opened the door for me. That night, I searched the county property database. The site was slow, and I entered the parcel number incorrectly twice. When the record finally appeared, it still showed my name. I exhaled. No transfer appeared. No sale. No new owner. I told myself that stress had turned coincidence into conspiracy. What I did not know was that the public index had not yet updated. The deed had already been recorded. 3 mornings later, an envelope arrived from a company I did not recognize. I nearly dropped it into the recycling bin. Then I saw the words, "Welcome, new property owner," through the plastic address window. The envelope was addressed to Daniel Peterson, but the property listed beneath his name was Harbor's Rest. I drove to the lake that same afternoon. I did not call my parents. I did not call Heather. I packed my laptop, the original insurance documents, and the key Grandpa had given me years earlier. The trip from Boston took less than 2 hours, though I remembered almost none of it. My mind moved through explanations. A clerical error, a neighboring property, a utility company mistake. Every explanation felt less believable than the one before it. When I turned onto the narrow road leading to Harbor's Rest, I saw a dark blue pickup truck parked beside the house. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch. Blue curtains hung in the upstairs window. Smoke rose from the chimney. For several seconds, I did not move. Then a boy ran out through the front door, followed by a golden retriever. He stopped when he saw me. "Mom," he called. "Someone is here." A woman appeared behind him, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She smiled politely. "Can I help you?" I got out of the car. "This is my house." The smile disappeared. "I'm sorry?" "Harbor's Rest. I own it." A man stepped onto the porch carrying a pry bar. He looked to be in his early 40s, with sawdust on his shoulders and concern already forming in his face. "My name is Daniel Peterson," he said. "This is my wife, Sarah." I looked from him to the child, then toward the open door. Through the doorway, I could see unfamiliar coats hanging in the hall. A casserole dish sat on the kitchen counter. A framed family photograph rested above Grandpa's fireplace. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Almost a month," Sarah said. The words landed harder than the envelope had. They were not visiting. They were living there. Daniel lowered the pry bar. "We bought this property." "No. We closed last month." "No, you did not." He glanced at Sarah. She went inside and returned with a folder. "Can I ask who you are?" she said carefully. "Claire Emerson." Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look. He removed a copy of the deed. The seller's name was printed clearly. Claire Marie Emerson. My name. The signature looked like mine from a distance. Up close, it looked too careful. The letters were evenly spaced. The final stroke curved upward exactly as mine did on formal documents. But I had not signed it. "I never sold this house." Daniel's face lost color. "We paid for it." "I believe you. We used a real estate agent. There was an appraisal, an inspection, a closing. We have title insurance." "I believe you, but I never agreed to any of this." Sarah pulled her son closer. Daniel asked, "Do you have identification?" The question did not offend me. From his perspective, I was a stranger claiming ownership of the home he had purchased. I showed him my driver's license. He compared the name to the deed. "This is impossible." "No," I said. "It is fraud." I called the county recorder from the driveway. An employee confirmed that a deed transferring Harbor's Rest from me to Daniel and Sarah Peterson, had been recorded 26 days earlier. I asked what identification had been used. She said the office could not provide that information by telephone. I asked who notarized the signature. She gave me a name I did not recognize. By then, my hands were shaking. Daniel offered me a chair. It felt unbearable to sit on furniture belonging to strangers outside a house that still felt like mine. He gave me the contact information for his real estate attorney and title company. I gave him my number. "I am not blaming you," I said. "We did not know," Sarah replied quickly. "I know." Their son watched me with frightened eyes. That was when I understood that my family had not only stolen from me, they had placed innocent people inside the wreckage. Before leaving, I walked to the edge of the porch. Someone had removed the old brass house numbers Grandpa installed years earlier and replaced them with modern black ones. The sight hurt more than it should have. My father called while I was driving back toward town. I let the phone ring. He called again. Then my mother. Then Heather. They knew. Perhaps a neighbor had seen me. Perhaps Daniel had called the agent, who called my father. I did not answer. I stopped near a diner and called Jessica Monroe. Jessica and I had met years earlier during a zoning dispute involving one of my projects. She specialized in real estate litigation and financial fraud. She was calm in ways that made other people stop panicking. "I need help," I said. She heard enough urgency in my voice to schedule a meeting that evening. By 6 o'clock, I sat in her office with the deed copy, the envelope, and every property document I could access online. Jessica read silently. When she finished, she asked, "Did you grant anyone power of attorney?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone to sign?" "No." "Did you agree to sell?" "No." "Did you receive any proceeds?" "Not that I know of." She examined the signature. "Who has access to samples of your handwriting?" "My family, my employer, banks, anyone who has seen my signature." "Who has access to personal information such as your birth date, social security number, prior addresses, and property records?" "My parents." She did not react. "Who has access to the house?" "My parents." "Who knew you had not visited recently?" "My parents and my sister." Jessica placed the deed flat on the desk. "Do not accuse anyone yet. You think they did it. I think we need evidence. They sold my grandfather's house. We do not yet know who completed the transaction, who received the money, or whether this deed is the only false document. What else could there be? A sale usually requires a purchase agreement, seller affidavits, tax forms, closing instructions, identity verification, wire authorization, and possibly disclosures." She began writing. "We need the full title file, the closing file, the notary journal, the appraisal records, the inspection access logs, and the banking documents. We also need to determine where the money went. What about the Petersons? They may be good faith purchasers. Their rights cannot be ignored simply because they were also deceived. It is my house." "I know." Her voice remained steady. "The emotional truth is simple. The legal solution may not be." We worked until after 9. Jessica sent preservation notices to the title company, closing agent, brokerage, notary, and bank. She contacted Daniel Peterson's attorney and requested that no further demolition occur. Then she asked for access to my banking history. That was when I remembered the old joint account. I logged in through a different portal and found it. The account was still open. My name remained on it with my parents. The balance was less than $100. Jessica leaned closer. "Download every statement." At first, nothing seemed unusual. There had been small deposits, occasional utility payments, and long periods of inactivity. Then, about 8 months earlier, withdrawals began. Several $100s. Then $1,000. Then $2,000. The descriptions referenced cashier's checks, electronic transfers, and vendor payments. A wedding planning company appeared twice. So did the hotel where Heather's reception was scheduled. I stared at the screen. They used the joint account. "This may be one piece," Jessica said. "We still need to know where the sale proceeds went." The following morning, North County Title produced part of the closing file. The property had sold for a little over $600,000. The seller had signed documents remotely. The proceeds had been wired to an account at a regional bank in the name of a family trust. I had never created that trust. The name was Claire Emerson Family Preservation Trust. The trustee listed on the account was my father. There were copies of identification. A driver's license bearing my name and photograph had been submitted electronically. The photograph was mine. The license number was not. The address belonged to my parents. Someone had taken an old professional photograph from my firm's website and used it to create false identification. The closing file stated that remote notarization had been completed. Jessica requested the recording. It did not exist. Instead, the notary claimed there had been a technical failure and relied on supplemental identification. That should never have been accepted, Jessica said. Will it matter? It may matter a great deal. 2 days later, a handwriting examiner concluded that the deed signature was a simulation. Whoever created it had practiced from genuine samples. Jessica then showed me copies of the purchase agreement, seller affidavit, and tax certification. Each carried my forged signature. I felt violated in a way I had not expected. They had not only taken the house, they had created a false version of me, one who agreed, signed, confirmed, and disappeared. The final document was a seller authorization directing proceeds into the trust controlled by my father. The signature looked like mine, but the initials beside one correction looked different. They belonged to my mother. I recognized the sharp angle of her capital E. Jessica looked up. This was not a single forged deed. My stomach tightened. No, it was an organized identity fraud scheme. The investigation took 12 days. Those 12 days changed how I understood my entire family. Jessica brought in a forensic accountant named Marcus Hale. He was quiet, precise, and incapable of expressing surprise, even when the evidence became astonishing. He traced the proceeds from the fraudulent trust through a series of transfers. Some money paid legitimate closing expenses. Some moved into my parents' personal accounts. A large portion went directly to vendors connected to Heather's wedding. The hotel, the florist, the gown boutique, the photographer, the orchestra, the caterer, the planner, the custom stationery company. Several payments had been made before the house was formally listed. That meant my parents had committed to wedding expenses before they had access to the sale proceeds. They expected the sale to succeed, Marcus said. They planned the theft before the listing, I replied. Jessica looked at the dates. They may have planned the wedding budget and the property fraud together. The title company's internal notes revealed that a woman claiming to be me had communicated through email and text. The email address resembled mine, but included an extra middle initial. The messages were polite and detailed. I am traveling for a major architectural project. I am unavailable during normal business hours. My father is assisting with administrative details. My family has authority to coordinate access. Each statement contained enough truth to appear believable. My father knew my work schedule. My mother knew how I wrote formal emails. Heather had access to photographs, biographical details, and examples of my signature. One message disturbed me more than the others. My sister may visit unexpectedly. She has emotional difficulty accepting the sale, but she has no ownership interest. Please direct all questions to my father. Jessica frowned. The person pretending to be you prepared the agent in case the real you appeared. They turned me into an unstable relative before I knew the house was being sold. The property had never been publicly listed. My parents arranged a quiet sale through an agent recommended by a friend. The Petersons had been searching for a lake house and accepted the opportunity before it reached the open market. The price was favorable but not suspiciously low. The appraiser visited while I was at work. My father provided access. Neighbors assumed I had decided to sell. One remembered seeing my mother carrying boxes from the house. Another saw Heather photographing the upstairs rooms. The inspection report stated that the seller was absent because of professional travel. Every detail had been designed to prevent questions. Then, Jessica uncovered the mail changes. Nearly 10 months before the wedding, someone redirected correspondence for Harbor's Rest, the town tax office. the homeowners association, the insurance carrier, the utility company, the local fire district. The new mailing address was my parents' home. A copy of the postal forwarding request bore my forged signature. That explained why routine notices had disappeared. It also explained the suspicious county email I deleted. The title company had sent certified notices to my parents' address. My mother signed for them. They had not simply forged documents at closing. They had spent nearly a year separating the property from me. Marcus then found changes to the homeowner's insurance policy. My mother had been added as an emergency contact through a telephone request. The carrier had not granted her ownership rights, but her name appeared often enough in the file to make her involvement seem ordinary. The association had also been told that my father managed maintenance on my behalf. The story had been repeated across several institutions until it began to resemble truth. The old joint bank account had served another purpose. My parents used it to create a financial history connected to my name. Small deposits passed through the account before being transferred to the fraudulent trust. Those transactions made the trust appear less suspicious during automated bank review. Money was also withdrawn from a separate savings account linked to the old profile. I had opened that account years earlier and forgotten it after switching banks. The balance had been a little over $40,000. My parents had taken almost all of it. The withdrawals began shortly after Heather's engagement. The amounts increased whenever wedding deposits came due. I looked at the statements and felt foolish. How did I miss this? The statements went to your parents' address, Marcus said. I should have remembered the account. You should not need perfect memory to prevent your family from stealing from you. The notary journal arrived on the 9th day. Paula Renwick had recorded the transaction as an in-person signing. That contradicted the title file, which described remote verification. Paula claimed the inconsistency was clerical. Her journal listed details from the false driver's license. The signature in the journal was not mine. A handwriting examiner believed it was written by my mother. Paula hired an attorney. That was when North County Title began cooperating fully. Its compliance officer admitted that several procedures had been ignored. The closing agent accepted identity documents through ordinary email rather than the secure verification platform. The required live video session never occurred. The seller's bank account was controlled by a third party. The mailing address changed shortly before closing. The person presented as the owner refused to attend in person. Every issue should have triggered enhanced review. Instead, the agent relied on my father's claim that he was a family financial advisor assisting his daughter. The title company suspended the employee and notified its insurer. Daniel and Sarah Peterson's attorney joined discussions with Jessica. They had already sold their previous home and invested savings into renovations. Jessica explained the possible legal outcomes. The forged deed could be declared void. Returning the property to me would leave the Petersons with serious losses unless the title insurer compensated them. Alternatively, a settlement could allow them to keep the property while paying me its full value plus damages. What do you want? Jessica asked. The house. She nodded. Then we fight for the house while making sure the innocent purchasers are compensated through insurance and professional liability claims. I did not want the Petersons punished. But I could not surrender Grandpa's home because my parents had succeeded in deceiving everyone. The criminal investigation began quietly. Jessica submitted evidence to the district attorney's financial crimes unit. An investigator interviewed the closing agent, notary, broker, bank staff, and neighbors. My parents did not know yet. At least, we believed they did not. I continued receiving wedding messages from my mother. She asked whether I had purchased a gift. She reminded me about the rehearsal dinner. She complained that I had not answered the planner quickly enough. Her normality frightened me more than anger would have. Heather sent me a photograph from her dress fitting. Almost here. Please try to act happy for me. I stared at the image. She looked beautiful. For one painful moment, I remembered her at 6 years old, running down the dock with a towel around her shoulders. I remembered helping with her homework and driving her to college. I wanted her to be innocent. Then, Marcus found a text thread in the closing file. The real estate agent had communicated with a number belonging to my mother. The agent asked whether the daughter had approved the final listing price. My mother replied, "Heather understands the family arrangement. Claire does not need to be involved until after the wedding." The agent answered, "I meant Claire, the owner." My mother wrote, "I am handling Claire. Speak only with Richard." That message did not prove Heather knew everything, but it placed her name inside the plan. Jessica requested Heather's vendor records. Several contracts were in her name. Payments came directly from the fraudulent trust. On one agreement, Heather had signed beneath a clause stating that she confirmed the source of funds was authorized. Then the wedding planner produced an email. The sender was Heather. The recipient was my mother. The subject line read, "Claire and the house." Heather wrote, "Are you sure she cannot stop this before the wedding? Lucas's parents will be humiliated if vendors cancel. You said once the property closes, she will have to accept that the money is already spent. I do not want to know every detail, but promise me this cannot come back on me." My mother replied, "Your sister has more than enough. She will be angry, but she will not destroy your wedding. I know her." Heather answered, "Then do not tell me anything else, until afterward." I read the exchange twice. Jessica asked whether I wanted to stop the wedding. "We could seek emergency relief," she said. "We could notify vendors that some funds may be traceable to fraud. We could confront your family now." For several minutes, I wanted exactly that. I wanted the flowers removed. I wanted the ballroom emptied. I wanted Lucas to learn the truth before saying his vows. Then I thought about the Petersons. I thought about the evidence still being assembled. I thought about my parents telling everyone that I had destroyed Heather's wedding out of jealousy. "No," I said. Jessica watched me. "You are not required to protect them." "I am not protecting them." "Then what are you doing?" "Choosing the moment." That afternoon, Marcus placed the complete wedding ledger in front of me. The final number was far higher than anything my parents could have paid legitimately. The house had not simply contributed to the wedding. The wedding had consumed the house. That was the first major truth. The second was worse. My parents had started redirecting mail and building the false financial trail before Heather and Lucas publicly announced their engagement. The plan had not grown out of last-minute panic. They had been preparing to take Harbor's Rest from me long before anyone asked me to admire the ring. The final accounting arrived 2 days before the ceremony. Marcus created a chart showing every major wedding expense and where the money came from. The ballroom package, catering, staffing, and event services came to nearly $200,000. Flowers, entertainment, photography, transportation, clothing, stationery, accommodations, planning fees, and guest gifts added well over $100,000 more. My parents had paid almost all of it. Not with investments. Not with retirement savings. Not with a loan. With the sale of Harbor's Rest, my forgotten savings, and transfers made through the old joint account. They had spent so aggressively that less than 1/4 of the sale proceeds remained. Some of the money went toward their own debts. My father paid off credit cards. My mother bought jewelry for the wedding. They placed a down payment on a luxury vehicle. The rest disappeared into Heather's celebration. Jessica warned that recovering every dollar would be difficult. Vendors had provided legitimate services and might not have known the funds were stolen. Some money could be recovered through insurance, judgments, frozen accounts, and restitution. Other losses would take time. "Will my parents go to prison?" I asked. "That depends on charges, plea negotiations, prior history, sentencing guidelines, and how the evidence is presented." "And Heather?" "Her exposure is different. Because she did not sign the deed. Because we have no evidence that she created the false identification or directly participated in the closing. But the emails show that she suspected the money came from your property and chose not to ask questions." That sounds convenient. It may be morally terrible without satisfying every element of a criminal offense. I hated the distinction. The law required proof of specific acts and intent. Betrayal required much less. Lucas knew almost nothing. After investigators contacted him about vendor payments, his attorney called Jessica. Lucas produced records showing that Heather told him her parents were selling family real estate. He believed they owned the property. Technically, her statement contained a fragment of truth. The real estate belonged to someone in the family. She simply left out that it belonged to me. Lucas's parents had contributed to the wedding as well, though far less. They believed Richard and Evelyn Emerson were financially comfortable. That illusion mattered deeply to my mother. She wanted the Bennetts to see our family as their equal. My father wanted to be admired. Heather wanted to enter her marriage appearing secure and successful. And I had become the resource they believed they could use without permission. The rehearsal dinner took place in a private dining room overlooking the city. My mother wore pale blue and moved from table to table greeting guests. My father opened expensive wine and gave a speech about sacrifice. Parents spend their lives building a future for their children, he said. Tonight, Evelyn and I are proud to see that future take shape. Heather smiled at him through tears. Lucas looked moved. I gripped my water glass. My parents had always been skilled at changing the moral meaning of their actions. When they demanded my time, they called it loyalty. When they dismissed my boundaries, they called it family closeness. When they favored Heather, they called it protecting the more sensitive child. When they took my property, they called it helping the family. After dinner, my mother pulled me aside. You have been distant all evening. I have been polite. This is your sister's wedding weekend. I know. She needs support. She has nearly 200 people supporting her. My mother lowered her voice. Do not create tension tomorrow. Why would I? You have always had difficulty when attention is not on you. The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. Instead, I looked at her. Are you worried about something? Her face remained still. No. Then enjoy the wedding. As I walked away, I felt her watching me. Heather found me near the elevator. Mom says you are acting strange. Mom says many things. Can you please get through tomorrow without making some point? What point do you think I might make? She looked toward the lobby. I do not know. You wrote that you did not want to know every detail. Her head turned sharply. What? I said you have a lot of details to manage. Her eyes narrowed. Claire, what is going on? For the first time, I saw real fear. I could have ended everything in that hallway. I could have shown her the email. I could have told her that attorneys, insurers, bank investigators, and prosecutors were already involved. Instead, I said, tomorrow is your wedding. Yes. Then you should rest. I entered the elevator. Just before the doors closed, she called my name. I looked at her. She appeared suddenly younger, almost like the child who once followed me down the dock. Do you hate me? She asked. The question hurt more than I expected. No, I said. But I no longer know who you chose to become. The doors closed. That night, I sat at the desk in my hotel room, with Grandpa's old pocketknife in my hand. He had left it to me, along with the house. The wooden handle was worn smooth. I remembered one summer afternoon when I was 14. A storm had damaged part of the dock, and I became frustrated while trying to cut through a rusted rope. Grandpa handed me the knife. A sharp tool does not need anger, he said. It needs direction. I thought about revenge. Revenge would have meant stopping the ceremony. It would have meant exposing Heather at the altar and making my parents watch the wedding collapse. The idea tempted me. But public humiliation would not restore Harbor's rest. It would not protect the Petersons. It would not strengthen the evidence. And it would give my family the chance to portray themselves as victims of my cruelty. I wanted consequences, not chaos. Before midnight, Jessica called. The civil complaints have been accepted. Service is scheduled for tomorrow morning after the wedding. And the criminal case? The investigator believes there is probable cause for multiple charges. The district attorney will make the final decision. Are the accounts frozen? The remaining trust funds are restricted. Your parents cannot move the money without triggering review. I looked toward the ballroom, several floors below. They think they got away with it. For tonight, I had purchased a wedding gift from Heather's registry. It was a crystal serving bowl. Beneath it, inside the box, I placed a handwritten card. May your marriage be built on more honesty than your wedding. I sealed the envelope. The following morning, I dressed in a dark green gown and pinned my hair back. I looked calm. That mattered. My parents expected emotion because emotion could be dismissed. Calm required explanation. Before leaving my room, I placed Grandpa's pocket knife in the safe. Then I picked up Heather's gift. It was the most expensive wedding gift I had ever given anyone. Because I knew it would be the last moment of uncomplicated happiness my family would have for a very long time. Heather's wedding was beautiful. That fact made everything worse. The ceremony took place beneath an arch of white roses and trailing greenery. Sunlight passed through tall windows and illuminated the rows of elegantly dressed guests. Lucas waited at the front with an expression of complete devotion. When Heather entered on my father's arm, the room rose. She looked radiant. For one moment, the evidence disappeared from my mind. She was simply my sister walking toward a man she loved. Then I saw the diamond bracelet on my mother's wrist. It had been purchased from the fraudulent trust. Reality returned. The officiant spoke about honesty, partnership, trust, and the promises that create a lasting marriage. I watched Heather repeat her vows. Her voice did not shake. Lucas promised to trust her. She smiled and promised the same. After the ceremony, guests moved into the cocktail reception while the ballroom was reset for dinner. My parents circulated proudly. Several people congratulated my father on hosting such an extraordinary event. He accepted every compliment without hesitation. Lucas's mother approached me near the bar. "You must be Claire. We have met," I said. She smiled apologetically. "Of course. Heather speaks about you often. I am sure she does. She says you are an architect." "I am. Your parents must be proud of both daughters." I looked across the room at my mother. "I think they are proud of the results they can display." Lucas's mother smiled uncertainly, unsure whether I had made a joke. The ballroom opened with music and applause. Heather and Lucas danced beneath chandeliers, while guests lifted phones to record them. Dinner arrived in carefully timed courses. Every surface glittered. I calculated how many months of work each decorative element represented. Not because I cared about the price. Because the money had once been the roof over Grandpa's table, the dock beneath our feet, and the trees where he taught me to recognize animal tracks. My parents had converted memory into centerpieces. During the speeches, Lucas's father welcomed Heather into the Bennett family. He praised her warmth, grace, and loyalty. My mother cried. Then my father took the microphone. He spoke about the first day he held Heather as a baby. He described her as the heart of our family. I had heard versions of the speech throughout my life. Heather was the heart. I was the structure expected to hold everything upright. My father continued. Creating this day required sacrifice, but there is no greater joy than giving your child the future she deserves. Guests applauded. My mother reached for his hand. Then Heather stood. She thanked Lucas, his parents, her friends, the wedding party, and our parents. Finally, she looked toward me. "And I want to thank my sister, Claire." Heads turned. My body became still. Heather smiled. "Claire has always been the strong one in our family. She taught me that strong women build their own lives. Even when we disagree, I know she would sacrifice anything for the people she loves." The applause began politely. Then Heather stepped away from the microphone and crossed the ballroom toward me. She opened her arms. I stood because refusing would create exactly the scene my parents expected. Heather embraced me in front of nearly 200 guests. "I could not have had this day without you," she whispered. The ballroom rose in applause. My mother was crying. My father smiled. The photographer captured the moment. Heather had transformed my silence into public consent. She wanted everyone to believe I had willingly helped create the wedding. That moment destroyed the last small part of me that had hoped she was merely confused. She knew enough. She knew the celebration existed because something had been taken from me, and she wanted the theft rewritten as generosity before an audience. When she released me, I smiled. "You are right," I said quietly. "You could not have had this day without me." Her smile faltered. I sat down. The dancing began after dessert. My mother approached while the orchestra played. "You could at least look happy," she said. "I am smiling, not sincerely." What would sincerity look like tonight? Her eyes hardened. "Do not do this here." Do what? Punish everyone because Grandpa favored you. This is not about favoritism. Everything with you comes back to that house. You are right. Her face changed. Only slightly. But I saw it. I leaned closer. You should enjoy the evening. What is that supposed to mean? It means the flowers are beautiful. She grabbed my wrist. Claire. I looked down at her hand. She released me. What have you done? She whispered. Nothing tonight. My father joined us. Is there a problem? No, I said. My mother looked at him, and something passed between them. Fear. Not certainty yet, but fear. Heather appeared holding her bouquet. Why are you all standing here? My father forced a smile. Family discussion. At my wedding? I picked up the gift box and handed it to her. Congratulations. She accepted it carefully. Thank you. There is a card inside. Her eyes searched mine. Claire, what is going on? I looked at my parents. My father had gone pale. My mother's mouth formed a rigid line. Around us, guests danced and laughed. The orchestra moved into a lively song. The photographer passed nearby without understanding the scene. For 1 second, I considered telling them everything. Then I remembered Jessica's instruction. Let the documents speak first. I stepped closer to Heather. Check your mailbox tomorrow. She stared at me. What? Tomorrow morning. My father said my name sharply. I turned away. My mother followed me into the corridor. What did you find? She demanded. I faced her. Why would there be anything to find? Stop playing games. I am not playing. Her composure fractured. We did what was necessary. The admission was quiet enough that the music covered it. I felt no triumph, only sadness. You sold Harbor's Rest. Her eyes widened. I do not know what you are talking about. You just said you did what was necessary for this family. There it is. She looked toward the ballroom entrance. You have plenty, Claire. That does not give you the right to erase my consent. Heather needed this. No one needs a wedding funded by fraud. My mother lowered her voice. You were barely using the house. You do not get to decide what I am allowed to keep. We thought you would understand afterward. You forged my name. Your father handled the paperwork. You signed the notary journal. She became completely still. I continued. You changed the mailing address. You collected certified letters. You used my photograph to create false identification. Claire, please. Tomorrow. What happens tomorrow? You will find out. She reached toward me, then stopped. You cannot ruin Heather's life. I did not build her wedding with stolen money. You are her sister. And you are my mother. That silenced her. I walked through the lobby and into the night. My father called twice before I reached my car. Heather sent 3 messages. The first asked what I meant. The second accused me of trying to frighten her. The third contained 1 sentence. Did you go to the house? I did not respond. Inside the ballroom, they kept dancing. Some guests later told investigators that my parents disappeared from the reception for almost half an hour. Heather cried in a private room. My father attempted to call the closing agent. The agent did not answer. By midnight, my parents understood that I knew. But they did not yet understand how much evidence existed. They believed family loyalty would keep me quiet. They did not realize the investigation had already reached their front door. The first process server reached my parents' house shortly after 8 the next morning. My father refused to open the door. The server waited until my mother attempted to leave through the garage. She received the civil complaint, asset preservation order, title litigation notice, and document retention demand. My father received his papers 20 minutes later. Heather and Lucas were served at the hotel. Lucas called Jessica before 9. Heather called me 17 times. I answered on the 18th. What did you do? She shouted. I filed a lawsuit. You had us served the morning after my wedding. I discovered you used money stolen from me. I did not steal anything. You knew the house was being used. I did not know how. You knew enough to ask whether I could stop it. Silence. Then she said, Mom told me you agreed. Your email says otherwise. What email? The one where you asked whether I could stop the sale before the wedding. Her breathing changed. They showed you that? The planner preserved it. I was scared. You were scared your vendors would cancel. I was getting married. That is not a defense. You could have talked to me. I asked where the money came from. You never told me you knew. You told Mom not to tell you anything else. She began crying. I thought she was borrowing against the house. It was not her house. I know that now. You knew it then. No. I knew Grandpa left it to you, but Mom said family property was complicated. She said Dad had authority. Did you ask to see that authority? No. Because you did not want the answer. She did not deny it. Lucas's voice sounded in the background. Heather said, "My marriage is already falling apart. You have been married less than 1 day. He thinks I lied to him. Did you?" Silence again. Then she hung up. My parents hired separate attorneys. Their first strategy was denial. My father claimed I had verbally authorized him to explore selling the house. My mother claimed the signatures might have been generated from electronic templates I had previously approved. Neither explanation survived the evidence. The false identification was undeniable. The trust account bore my father's signature. The mail forwarding request matched my mother's handwriting. The title company admitted procedural failures. Bank surveillance footage showed my parents establishing the fraudulent trust. My father presented the false identification packet. My mother sat beside him. Investigators executed search warrants at their house. They seized computers, phones, financial records, and a printer containing digital files of my signature. My mother had stored scanned documents inside a folder labeled Claire Property. Inside were copies of my driver's license, tax records, old checks, draft signatures, and correspondence. There were spreadsheets tracking wedding expenses and proceeds from the sale. One column was labeled House Funds. Another was labeled Claire Account. The labels destroyed any argument that the transactions were accidental. Paula Renwick, the notary, eventually admitted that she never met me. My father paid her to notarize the documents outside normal procedures. Paula claimed she believed the transaction was authorized within the family. The district attorney did not accept that explanation. North County Title's insurer entered formal negotiations with the Petersons. Daniel and Sarah had stopped renovations. They were living among exposed walls and unfinished floors while the legal dispute continued. I met them at the house with Jessica. It was my first time entering Harbor's Rest since discovering the sale. The interior looked both familiar and wounded. The Petersons had removed wallpaper in the dining room. The kitchen cabinets were gone. Furniture had been moved into storage. Sarah apologized repeatedly. "You did nothing wrong," I told her. "We should have asked more questions. You followed the process. The process failed you. It failed all of us." Daniel looked toward the lake. "We love this place." "I understand. That was the most painful part. They loved it too. Not the way I did, perhaps, but honestly. Their son had chosen the smaller bedroom because its window faced the trees. Sarah planned to restore the porch. Daniel had already repaired part of the roof. They were not villains. Jessica proposed a resolution. The Petersons would relinquish any claim once the deed was declared void. The title insurer would reimburse their purchase price, reasonable renovation expenses, moving costs, temporary housing, and certain legal fees. The closing company, notary, and professional insurers would contribute. I would regain the property without repaying money I had never received. The Petersons agreed in principle. Before leaving, Sarah handed me a wooden box. We found this beneath a loose floorboard in the upstairs closet. Grandpa's initials were carved into the lid. I had never seen it before. "What is inside?" I asked. We did not open it. I held it against my chest. For the first time since the fraud began, I nearly cried. I placed the box in Jessica's office safe without opening it. Something told me the moment was not yet right. The civil case moved faster than expected because the evidence was overwhelming. My parents attempted to negotiate. Their lawyers proposed returning remaining funds, transferring assets, and admitting civil liability in exchange for my support in resolving the criminal case. I refused to control a prosecution that did not belong to me. My mother asked for a meeting. It took place in a conference room with attorneys present. My parents looked older. My father avoided my eyes. My mother began by saying, We never intended to hurt you. You intended to take my property. We intended to solve a family problem. Heather's wedding was not an emergency. You do not understand what was at stake. What was at stake? Her future. Her relationship with the Bennetts. Her place in that family. And my future? You already had one. The answer explained everything. In my mother's mind, success had disqualified me from protection. Because I had a career and a house, anything taken from me became less serious. My father finally spoke. We plan to pay you back. With what? He did not answer. You spent most of it. We thought the market would improve. I had investment opportunities. You gambled my inheritance on investments you hoped might succeed? He looked down. My mother leaned forward. If this continues, your father could go to prison. That is a consequence of his choices. And me? You signed documents. I am your mother. You remembered that after you were caught. She recoiled. My father said, your grandfather would not want this. The sentence filled me with calm. Grandpa spent years protecting that house from you. That is not fair. He left it to me because he understood what you would do if you had control. My father's face reddened. You always believed you were better than us. No, I believed you were my family. I stood. That was your greatest protection. You used it until there was nothing left. Heather's marriage did not collapse immediately, though Lucas moved into a separate room in their apartment. His parents hired counsel. Wedding photographs appeared online, while rumors spread through their social circle. Heather was not charged with forging the deed. Investigators found no evidence that she created false identification or participated directly in the closing. But she had signed vendor certifications and accepted payments while suspecting the funds were unauthorized. Her lawyer negotiated a cooperation agreement requiring truthful testimony, repayment of certain gifts and unused vendor refunds, and participation in the civil resolution. Lucas postponed their honeymoon. Then Lucas did something no one expected. He turned over a backup drive containing home security recordings from the apartment Heather used during wedding planning. One file captured a conversation between Heather and our parents nearly 9 months before the wedding. My parents were discussing the budget. My father said he could access Claire's lake property, if necessary. Heather responded immediately. No, she will never agree. My mother said, she does not have to know until the money is available. There was a long silence. Heather said, I do not want you doing anything illegal. My father laughed. It is family property. It is in her name. She received more than her share. Heather repeated, I do not want anything illegal. For several minutes, she resisted. Then my mother began talking about Lucas's family. She warned Heather that the Bennetts might believe she came from an unstable or less successful background. She said canceling vendors would humiliate everyone. She said I was wealthy enough to absorb the loss and would eventually be repaid. Heather asked, what happens if Claire finds out before the wedding? My mother answered, she will not. Heather's final words were quiet. Then do not tell me how you do it. The recording changed everything emotionally. Heather had understood the moral line clearly. Then, when honesty became expensive, she stepped away from it. She did not create the fraud. She gave herself permission to benefit from it. When Lucas delivered the recording, he also provided email exchanges in which he had questioned the wedding budget. Heather repeatedly told him her parents were using money from family property. He had believed the phrase meant property they owned. His evidence helped distinguish his role from hers. For the first time in her life, Heather could not cry until someone else carried the consequence. She first denied responsibility. Then she blamed our parents. Then she blamed the pressure from Lucas's family. Then she blamed me for being distant. Only after Lucas moved out for several weeks did she begin reading the evidence without searching for someone else to blame. The preliminary title hearing occurred 5 months after the wedding. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. There was no dramatic jury, only attorneys, records, testimony, and a judge who appeared unimpressed by emotional explanations. My parents' lawyer argued that they believed they possessed implied family authority. Jessica stood. Ownership does not transfer through family assumption, she said. Consent cannot be manufactured because a person is successful, absent, or expected to forgive. The handwriting expert explained how the signatures had been simulated from genuine samples. The title company compliance officer admitted that the closing should have been stopped once the seller refused live verification and the funds were directed to an account controlled by someone else. Daniel Peterson testified that my father described me as emotionally unstable and unable to accept the sale. Then Lucas testified. He described what Heather told him about the money, and when he began to suspect the truth, my mother took the stand. She claimed she believed family discussions gave my father authority. The judge asked, "Where is the written authorization?" There was none. "Where is the power of attorney?" There was not one. "Where is Miss Emerson's consent?" My mother looked toward me. She knew we needed money. That was not my question. Then the judge asked the question that changed the room. "Mrs. Emerson, if you believed your daughter agreed, why did you create identification in her name?" My mother had no answer. For the first time, she had nowhere to hide. The court issued its ruling 3 weeks later. The deed transferring Harbor's Rest to Daniel and Sarah Peterson was void from the beginning because my signature had been forged and I had never authorized the sale. Legal title remained with me. The Petersons' claims against the title insurer, closing company, broker, notary, and responsible professionals proceeded under the settlement framework negotiated by the parties. They received reimbursement for the purchase price, approved renovation expenses, moving costs, and temporary housing. It was not a perfect resolution. They lost time, plans, and the belief that a properly completed closing guaranteed ownership, but they did not lose their savings. Harbor's Rest returned to me. The civil judgment against my parents included the stolen bank funds, unrecovered sale proceeds, legal expenses, property damage, and additional damages connected to fraud and conversion. Their house became subject to a lien. Several accounts were seized. The luxury vehicle was surrendered. My mother's jewelry purchases were sold. The remaining balance in the fraudulent trust was transferred to restitution. The criminal case continued for several more months. My father pleaded guilty to forgery, identity fraud, larceny, conspiracy, and related financial offenses. Because the scheme was planned, involved substantial value, harmed multiple victims, and required repeated falsification, he received a custodial sentence followed by supervised release and restitution obligations. My mother pleaded guilty to forgery, identity fraud, conspiracy, and related offenses. Her sentence included a shorter period of incarceration, home confinement after release, probation, and restitution. Paula Renwick lost her notary commission, received probation under a cooperation agreement, paid penalties, and faced civil liability. The title company employee responsible for ignoring verification requirements was dismissed. The company implemented new procedures and paid regulatory penalties. The law did not restore the family I thought I had. It assigned responsibility. That was enough. Heather avoided criminal conviction after cooperating and returning assets linked directly to the stolen money. She sold several luxury wedding gifts. The designer reception dress was consigned. Unused travel credits were surrendered. Her public image collapsed. More importantly, Lucas no longer trusted her. They began counseling. For months, I expected their marriage to end. It did not. Lucas eventually concluded that Heather had not designed the fraud, but she had chosen comfort over truth. Whether their marriage could survive, that was their responsibility. After the final civil order, Jessica called me into her office. The wooden box from Harbor's Rest sat on the conference table. "You can take it now," she said. I carried it back to the lake house. The Petersons had moved out. Their insurer handled the remaining repairs. The house felt hollow without furniture, but it was mine again. I walked through each room slowly. In the kitchen, faint marks remained where Grandpa measured my height against the doorframe. In the living room, the stone fireplace still carried a chip from the time Heather knocked over an iron tool as a child. The dock needed work. The porch needed paint. The upstairs bathroom was still outdated. For the first time, those problems felt comforting. They were ordinary. They belonged to a house, not a crime. I placed the wooden box on the kitchen table. The lid was secured with a brass clasp. Inside were photographs, receipts, property records, and several letters tied with faded blue ribbon. One envelope carried my name. The handwriting belonged to Grandpa. I opened it carefully. Claire, if you are reading this, then you have found something I hoped you would never need. I stopped. My hands trembled. Grandpa explained that he had hidden copies of older property records because my father had pressured him for years to transfer or sell Harbor's Rest. He wrote that my parents believed assets should flow toward the family member with the greatest immediate need, regardless of ownership. He had seen them borrow without permission, change agreements after the fact, and justify every action as temporary. Then I reached the passage that made me close my eyes. Your parents may one day convince themselves that what belongs to you also belongs to them. They will not call it theft. They will call it fairness, necessity, or family. That will make it more dangerous, not less. Grandpa had known. Not the exact details. Not the wedding. Not the forged deed. But he understood their character. The box contained more than a letter. There was a notarized affidavit in which Grandpa documented repeated conversations with my father. My father had asked to be added to the deed. He had asked for authority to manage the property. He had argued that Heather might need the house more someday. Grandpa refused every request. The affidavit included a specific instruction. No future transfer involving Harbor's Rest should be trusted unless I appeared personally with independent legal counsel. There were also letters Grandpa sent to Martin Keller expressing concern that my father might attempt to pressure me after his death. One sentence stood out. Richard does not believe Claire's independence is a reason to protect her. He believes it is evidence that she can afford to lose. My mother had said almost the same thing during our meeting. You already had a future. The final document in the box was a copy of an earlier deed with handwritten notes in Grandpa's margin. Beside my name, he had written, "She maintains what others merely want." That was the second major truth. I had spent months believing Grandpa left me Harbor's Rest because I helped repair it. He had left it to me because he knew I would defend the meaning of ownership itself. The title company never saw Grandpa's affidavit because its employee failed to contact the estate attorney or examine the probate file carefully. Jessica later used the documents to strengthen the remaining civil claims. But their legal value mattered less to me than their emotional meaning. Grandpa had not left the house to me casually. He had built layers of protection because he feared exactly what eventually happened. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "You may believe that keeping peace is kinder than defending yourself. Remember that false peace asks the innocent person to carry the cost of another person's wrongdoing. Do not confuse silence with mercy." I sat at the kitchen table until the light outside turned gold. For 6 years, I had thought Grandpa's gift was Harbor's Rest. The house was only part of it. He had also left me permission to trust what I saw, even when my family insisted I was cruel for seeing it. That evening, I repaired the old lock on the front door. The work was simple. I removed the damaged hardware, aligned the plate, tightened the screws, and tested the key. The door opened smoothly. Then it closed. For the first time in years, I locked it knowing no one could take my consent, my voice, or my home from me again. Nearly 2 years passed before Heather asked to meet me at Harbor's Rest. She arrived alone. Her marriage to Lucas had survived, though barely. They had moved into a smaller apartment and spent months in counseling. Heather had found work outside the social circle that once defined her. She looked different. Not older, exactly. Less protected. We sat on the porch while wind moved through the trees. "I am not here to ask you to forget," she said. "Good." I spent a long time telling myself I did not know enough to stop it. "You knew enough to avoid asking." She nodded. That is what I finally understood. She did not cry immediately. That mattered. The old Heather had cried whenever she needed someone else to move first. This time, she continued, I kept saying Mom and Dad lied to me. They did. But I also gave them the silence they needed. Yes, I wanted the wedding more than I wanted the truth. The honesty hurt, but it did not anger me. It was the first real apology she had offered. Heather told me she was pregnant. Then she asked whether I would consider becoming her daughter's godmother. I did not answer immediately. Why me? Because I want her to know someone who will tell her the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. I agreed. But I did not pretend trust had returned. Forgiveness was not restoration. It was simply the decision not to carry hatred forever. My relationship with my parents remained distant and structured. Their apologies came slowly and often contained explanations. I no longer argued with those explanations. The court had already answered them. I restored Harbor's Rest room by room. I repaired the porch, rebuilt the dock, and preserved Grandpa's measurements on the kitchen doorframe. Lucas helped once, though he did not stay long. He carried lumber from the truck and repaired a loose section of railing. We did not discuss Heather. We did not need to. Several months after Heather's daughter was born, she brought the baby to the lake. We sat beneath the birch trees while the child slept against her shoulder. Heather looked toward the dock. I used to think this place was only special because Grandpa chose you. It was special before either of us understood why. She nodded. I was jealous. I know. I thought you receiving the house meant there was less love left for me. Grandpa did not divide love by property. I understand that now. When her daughter became old enough to walk, she took her first uncertain steps across the porch at Harbor's Rest. Heather remained close behind her. I waited near the door. The child reached toward me and said the word she had been practicing for weeks. Godmother. I lifted her into my arms. Behind us, sunlight moved across the lake. For years, I had believed protecting family meant absorbing whatever damage they caused. Grandpa taught me otherwise. Harbor's Rest was never merely a house. It was the place where I learned that forgiveness does not require surrender, that love does not erase ownership, and that peace built on silence is only another form of loss. Truth may arrive slowly. It may come through a forgotten envelope, a frightened family on a porch, a courtroom question, or a letter hidden beneath a floorboard. But once truth reaches the door, no lie can keep it outside forever.